Hi everyone, Miss Doble here. So today we're going to be talking about cell theory and cell membranes. So, what is cell theory? Cell theory was invented in 1838 by the German scientists Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann. Now the cell theory has three very important parts. The first is that all living organisms are composed of one or more cells. Now we can break this down into two further ways, which is that there are organisms that are unicellular, meaning they're only comprised of one cell, or they're multicellular, which means they're comprised of two or more cells. The second part of cell theory is that cells only arise from pre-existing cells. This means that cells can't just spontaneously happen. They have to come from cells that have already existed. Now this can get a little bit confusing because you have to wonder where the very first cells came from, but that's a long discussion for another day. Hopefully you guys, if you're really interested in that, will do a little bit of research on your own. If not, we'll get to it in time. Alright, so the third part of the cell theory is that the cell is the most basic form of life. This means that of everything in the world that's alive, it's not made up of anything smaller than a cell. Like we said before, there are unicellular organisms that are only made up of one cell, and those are the smallest forms of life. So, this theory, the cell theory, gives us an operational understanding of all life, which is pretty huge if you think about it. Now, we can break this down into three parts as well. So you have your eukaryotes. Now, eu is Latin for true, and karyote is Latin for nucleus. So organisms that are eukaryotes are true nucleus organisms. They have a nucleus inside of the cell. So other things to know about eukaryotes are that they have membrane-bound organelles, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and they actually evolved from prokaryotes. Now that's not going to make sense until we talk about prokaryotes. Prokaryotes come from the Latin before nucleus, so these cells actually don't have those true nucleuses in them. Now again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So this is the earliest kind of cell type, and it has no membrane-bound organelles. So it's very, very basic. The last thing I want to talk about quickly is viruses. Now viruses are pretty controversial because actually it hasn't quite been decided whether they're living or not. Now this is because they can only produce inside a living host. They don't actually have the machinery that they need to survive and reproduce on their own. They have genes, but they have no cellular structure within which those genes are held in. So it gets a little bit muddled if you're thinking about, are they alive or are they not? I'd love to hear if you have any theories because again, this isn't something anyone's ever really decided. So I want you to keep in mind that the cell theory is something that you're going to be tested on really quickly at the beginning of class tomorrow so you can jump right into the lab. So take a second, look at the three important parts of the cell theory, and try and commit them to memory a little bit. Alright, ready to go? The next thing I want to talk about is microscopes. Now the compound microscope was invented in the 1590s by Zacharias Jensen and his father Hans. Now if you look at this microscope here, you can see all of the important parts of it that you'll be using. Most importantly is the eyepiece. That's what you actually look through. Now you also have the coarse and fine focus, which is how you can zoom in and out on what you're trying to look at. And the stage is pretty important as well. That's where you'll actually put your slide that you're going to look at through the eyepiece. So one of the reasons the microscope was so important is because in 1665, Robert Hooke was using this exact same kind of microscope to look at a cork. And he noticed it was comprised of small sections, and he was the very first person to talk about and describe cells. He even came up with the name. So this was the first time that plant cells were ever described and recorded. Now that cork was obviously not a living cell, so it was hollowed out, but it has the same structure. And we're going to be looking at some plant cells tomorrow, so hopefully you can get a glimpse at what Robert Hooke actually saw when he was the first person to identify cells. So cells have 8 very, very important properties, and these are properties that every single living cell has, so they're very important to remember. The first is that they're all complex and organized. Now this means they have those internal structures we were talking about. Membrane-bound structures are called organelles, and if they're not membrane-bound, then they just sort of float around in the cytoplasm, which you'll see in a second. The second is that all cells contain a genetic blueprint and the machinery to use it. Now think of the blueprints you would use to build a house. Those should be universal. Anywhere that you go, if you give those blueprints to a builder, they should know exactly what to make, and it should look pretty much the same. Now, unless there are any mutations, those universal instructions, or blueprints, should build proteins that carry out key functions for the cell. All cells arise from the division of other cells. So like we were talking about before, they can't spontaneously happen, so some of the ways that they come to exist is through binary fission, if it's a bacteria, asexual mitosis, or sexual meiosis. Now this is very important because even humans follow these rules. Remember, we're just living things like everything else. The fourth property is that all cells acquire and use energy. So plants are famously known for using photosynthesis to create their own food from sunlight. Now our own cells do something similar. It's called respiration. And just like photosynthesis, it results in the creation of ATP, which is usable energy for our cells. The fifth property is that all cells can perform a variety of chemical reactions. Now I bet you've heard this word before. This is called metabolism. All reactions are performed by cells are classified as metabolism. So think about it. When you take in food and you metabolize it, you're using that food, carrying out chemical reactions, and getting that energy from it. Number 6 is that all cells engage in mechanical activities. This basically just means that they can move and they can respond to stimuli, such as light or chemicals. So that's pretty important to know too, because if they're all staying in the same place, things aren't going to work as well as they need to. The seventh is that all cells can regulate activities, such as they control what's happening within themselves, so that's also pretty important. And the last thing to know is that they all contain the following structures. Keep this in mind. Every living cell has a plasma membrane, a cytoplasm, and nuclear material. Now, a plasma membrane separates the cell from its external environment. So if it's a multicellular thing, then it's one cell being separated from other cells. And if it's a unicellular organism, it's that cell being separated from everything around it. A cytoplasm is the fluid-filled center of the cell, and the nuclear material is basically the genetic information stored as DNA. So, this is a brief explanation of what an animal cell looks like. And what I really want you to notice is that dark purple coating is the plasma membrane. So think about it like you'd think of an M&M. That chocolate coating on the outside, that candy that you eat, that you bite down and gives that nice crunch, that's actually protecting the chocolate on the inside. This plasma membrane separates the entire cell from everything that's outside of it. Now some things can just move right through the plasma membrane, such as water. It can get in and out through something called osmosis, and it's very easy for the cell to deal with. Other things are much larger and have a harder time getting through that plasma membrane, and so there are proteins on the outside of the plasma membrane that will help carry things inside. One other thing to notice is the nucleus in the middle there. That's pretty important too. Remember, that's where all our fun DNA is stored. So we're going to talk for just a second more about plasma membranes. This is a microscopic layer of lipids and proteins that forms the external boundary of the cytoplasm. So if you look at it, that's called a phospholipid bilayer. Those little blue circles with their tails hanging off, those are phospholipids. And they're pretty important as to how this plasma membrane helps the cell. So those big purple things that you're seeing are the transport proteins I was saying. And some of them move things in and out of the cell, while others are just important for recognizing other cells. So that's something that's very helpful to a cell when it needs to know where its environment is. So take a good look at that. Keep in mind that this microscopic layer of lipids and proteins is going to regulate the passage of molecules in and out of that cytoplasm. It's very important. It controls everything that goes into and comes out of a cell. So last but not least, here are these important references. If you have any further questions, you can look at those. And hopefully you learned a little bit so we can jump into class tomorrow and look at some pretty awesome stuff under the microscope. All right, thanks for listening. Bye for now.